Have you tried Music to Code By yet? Well, why not? Here's a comment Joe left on the website. This is also great music to mow by. I like listening to music while doing yard work to help the monotony of it seem less tedious. This past summer, I started listening to these tracks while doing yard work, and they worked great. I could let the music play in the background without focusing on it, and it seemed to help me concentrate on getting through my tasks. Thanks, Joe. And now you can download the entire 13-track collection. That's over 5.5 hours of music to code by for only $39. Check it out at musictocodeby.net. Welcome back to .NET Rocks. This is Carl Franklin.
And this is Richard Campbell.
And this is the first show that we have recorded in a long time.
In better part of a month, yeah?
Yep.
This is what happens when you get a little far ahead. We did a lot of shows at NDC. This was supposed to be an NDC show.
Right. And basically, a lot of things have happened in my world. I threw a festival for the first time. I threw a conference.
Nice.
Yeah, it was called Keto Fest at ketofest.com, my first one. We actually were successful. We broke even. And we had 238 people come from all over the world to eat meat and bacon. 100 pounds of bacon we served. And talk about the science of low carb.
There you go.
Yeah. So I'm not going to belabor that. Just go check it out at ketofest.com if you're interested. But first, before we get started with Elle, we have this little thing we call Better Know a Framework.
Awesome. All right, dude, what do you got?
So if you remember from all of those, there's a handful of shows that we did at NDC where I was talking about all the cool plugins for Xamarin that James Montemagno has developed.
He has made many.
Yes. And so this is another one. It's an in-app billing plugin for Xamarin and Windows.
Oh, cool.
So it queries item information, purchase items, restore items, and more. That's pretty much the simple explanation, but you can go get it at NuGet, or just, this is show 1469. So the plan. Go to 1469.pwop.me, and it's also on our website, linked on our website.
Cool, dude.
Go James.
Yep. He's still cranking that stuff out. He's crazy.
He is crazy, and we love him.
Yeah.
All right, man. Who's talking to us today?
I dipped into the Wayback Machine here because we have just done enough shows on accessibility.
Yeah, no.
And this goes all the way back to 2012, show 761. So I'm thinking almost exactly half a show, 700 shows ago, right?
Wow.
So, yeah, this was the show we did with Jerome Hulsher, when we were talking about accessible web applications, and Richard Garside, who I believe we've had on as a guest, but have never sent a mug, said, and this is 5 years ago, admittedly. While working for an organization that took accessibility very seriously, I learned a lot about how different people's abilities affect their use of the web. One thing I learned that surprised me was that there's a number of people who've been deaf since an early age who either struggle to read or can't read at all. The reason for this makes perfect sense when you're told most written languages are phonetic. Yeah. And if you've never heard the words, it's much more difficult to learn how to read them from the letters. Most people are able to learn, but it takes them longer. For those that can read but struggle, closed captions are hard to keep up with. So I think this is why we reach the highest standard of accessibility. You have to include signer interpreting on video.
Wow.
So it's really, reading lips and closed captioning, so forth, they sound like an answer, but only to someone who can read at the pace that someone speaks, which, face it, is fast.
Right.
And once upon a time, I went with a girl who signed. She could speak, but part of her job was she was signing. So I learned a fair bit of American Sign Language.
Yep.
And I'll tell you, that is an incredibly efficient language.
Yeah.
Like, just smart the way that it works. We should all be so clever to build an efficient language like that. So I totally get it. ASL makes a lot of sense in that scenario. So Richard, thank you so much for your comment. A .NET Rocks mug is on its way to you. And if you'd like a .NET Rocks mug, write a comment on the website at .NETRocks.com. And if we read your comment on the show, we'll send you a mug.
And definitely follow us on Twitter. He's at Rich Campbell. I'm at Carl Franklin. Send us a tweet. We convert them to interpretive dance. And that brings us to our guest today, Elle Waters, evangelizing the growth of universal design and lean accessibility as best practices within large organizations. Elle works on behalf of Simply Accessible with startups and enterprise-level clients to build the foundation needed to integrate accessibility into every facet of corporate culture. She's worked firsthand with design, content, development, and testing teams to create agile, scalable methods to ensure more inclusive user experiences. She's seen amazing things happen where the user's needs are the primary driver for change and innovation in large-scale digital projects where teams meet and even exceed their specific product goals, and where companies leap ahead of their competition, all by putting accessibility first. Elle has a passion for all things agile and a fascination with emerging technology and a healthy fear of zombies.
I think that's only sensible, really.
Welcome, Elle.
Thank you so much for having me.
What do you think of the comment that Richard read? Is it really feasible to have to drop video of a sign language interpreter into everything that you put on YouTube?
I think it depends on the industry and what kind of audience you have, to be honest. I do think it's rapidly evolving and changing. As with most things, with the mobile moment and adoption of mobile technologies, texting has become a really popular medium for different people in the deaf community. And sign language is actually, much like Braille, becoming a bit of a literacy issue, where that's becoming less common. So I think that with everything having to do with support for an inclusive approach, it always starts with users first. And so understanding exactly whether or not this would be measurably impactful in a positive way for people is the first question. And the more you collaborate with people on finding that solution, the more likely you are to be successful. So that's a roundabout way of saying it depends.
Depends, yeah. Welcome to the club.
As a user experience professional should tell you, we should all wear tattoos with that. But I do think that there's a huge point that was made that I think is really valuable. And I think it can even kind of surface to a higher principle, which is things that we assume are our primary format may not be someone else's primary format. And
That's
oftentimes you'll hear words like alternate format, and it may very much be someone else's primary format. And so that's the consideration overarchingly to think about when you're building things, is that you want to be able to find multiple ways to accomplish the same thing, to get the same information without requiring and preferencing one over another too much so.
And I think that one of the things Richard was commenting on there was that at closed caption speed, so at the speed of a typical hearing person speaking, it's challenging for someone who consumes that information differently to keep up. Where a text message, because you can look at it as long as you want to. Plus, I think that the language of texting is terser and a narrower set of words, probably way more consumable.
Agreed.
You've probably both had this experience where you're watching, CNN or something, and there's closed captioning on, and you find that the closed caption gets so far behind that eventually they just skip over a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, it's true. And texting is a predictable medium. And I think that's a really good point, is the content is really in some way, you're usually at least a participant in it. So you're an author. So half of that time is spent crafting a message as much as reading it. So it is definitely a different kind of medium. I think that usually whenever we're working with teams, we like to look at it, and this is one reason why we're such big fans of Agile. We like to look at things in an iterative way. So at the very least, have a text transcript of whatever video and multimedia product that you're putting out, then layer upon that and think in terms of closed caption, and then iterate afterwards and think about and find out from your users if sign language would be a good option. I know that there's a lot of organizations who have made that commitment. And I'm sure given the way that people tend to respond as brand loyalists whenever their needs are considered, that's probably really reinforced their understanding of thinking about other people's needs.
I wonder if we're not on our way, or maybe this already exists, to some sort of animation that interprets text into ASL.
It's definitely in the works. There's a lot of innovative technologies. So there is, and I'll send you a link you can post as well. There's a technology right now where it's an tablet application, and it's reading those gestures, and then it speaks aloud the sign language gestures that it reads.
Wow.
The difficulty
So sign to
is
text.
Yeah. That's sign to text. I was just about to say text to sign is a much more complicated endeavor. Sure. And there's a lot of subtleties that are beyond when someone is using sign that's outside of the hands. Right. There are facial gestures and other things like that that are cues and nuances to what's being conveyed in ASL and other sign languages, I would assume too, even though I don't know them.
But I think there's an opportunity for a service there that somebody can, do a green screened ASL version of your, video of, any kind of YouTube that, there's definitely a room for a service there. I
think it would be fascinating to explore.
I have been keeping up with a lot of AI stuff because I've been doing some talks and stuff in that space. And some of the latest video animation where they were literally taking spoken word and just turning the expressions on for that. Like, there's tech coming. What makes me laugh is, of course, this is going to be solved just about the time that people aren't all that worried about it anymore. There are just more efficient ways to communicate. Yeah.
It's incredible. A lot of innovation. There's kind of a running joke, at least among me and my friends, that innovation really comes from three industries: from the gaming industry, from pornography, and from accessibility. And so when you look at it, there's a lot of digital innovation that comes out of that. And so there's a lot of things that we depend on in our mobile devices that actually originated with an accessibility need. Right. So given the way that things are going with AI, the way that things are going with VR and AR, and the understanding that digital is a space that's really, in a lot of people's opinion, a place of public accommodation, that people should be able to do things equally and without being locked out of an experience, it's going to be a pretty amazing next several years. It's already been pretty amazing so far.
If you think about the operating systems that people use, Windows, Mac being the primary two, what grade do you give them for their accessibility features?
It's a little bit apples to oranges. I will say that with regards to commitment to built-in accessibility features, Windows has always been very good about document accessibility. So Microsoft Word, Excel, those kinds of things for applications. But Apple has made tremendous strides from an inclusive design perspective. So more than just access, but really thinking holistically about the user experience and building in voiceover as technology, screen reading technology in both desktop and in mobile devices kind of sets them ahead a bit in that way. They were also very quick to adopt switch technology in iOS. And so those kinds of considerations, I think that what we're seeing as a company, that when we're talking about mobile technologies, typically iOS definitely meets the needs of people with mobility impairments and people with visual impairments a little bit better.
Yeah, I had never used any of the accessibility features, but I think people like me have stumbled across hitting a key by accident, and all of a sudden Windows is talking to you.
Yeah. Now, with that said, Windows and Microsoft are making some tremendous strides, and they are very committed. And I think that it's more unusual these days for us to find organizations who don't have, especially those who are software builders, who don't have some kind of approach and understanding beyond just the human rights aspect of it. It's really smart for business to be more inclusive. If you're talking about 15% of the population, it's kind of foolhardy to not consider that and still try and build for, older versions of Internet Explorer, for example.
Yeah. I remember, this is just an old story from an old guy. I remember having a friend who was legally blind and, had to walk with a cane and everything, and sitting and watching him using his Apple IIe and just absolutely flying. His keyboard skills were amazing, and he could read any part of the screen. Of course, it was just text, but he could do anything and kill it. And he ended up running an ISP in the days of modems and early days of internet.
Yeah, it's pretty astounding to think about the way that human beings are so adaptable, and the average screen reader speed is almost unintelligible to most people who are sighted users who don't use a screen reader,
Right.
because people just adapt to it. And the way that they consume information, people who use screen readers on a daily basis, is actually very different, because it is reading the document object model and it's looking directly at the source code. It tends to be a very linear experience. And obviously different types of interactions require different kinds of exploration versus just transactional, but it does change the entire mental model. And we found this through a lot of our usability testing. Obviously, a company named Simply Accessible, it is what we do. It's what we think about all day long. And so we have a pretty expert level understanding about how people with disabilities use the web, but we're consistently surprised and educated through usability testing. And so we found that to be true at times. Just as an example, when sites have gone responsive, that's actually changed some of the way that people are interacting with websites. So last year, or it may have been the year before, 2 years ago. Yeah, it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, we were doing usability testing for some of our airline clients, and they had responsive sites. And we found that of the 8 participants that we had tested, 3 of them who were screen reader users did not use a monitor at all because they lived at home. Wow. They had no need to be able to display visually the content that they were consuming. But what this did at the operating system level is it threw the site into a mobile breakpoint. So the people were using desktop technologies like JAWS or NVDA, and they were actually interacting with the mobile version of the site, which totally blew our minds and really caused us to rethink which technologies we need to consider, and how people will be interacting with content is really an open-ended thing with the level of device independence and user control that we have now among the average person. People could be putting together a whole system of things that there's no way that you would know. So you need to consider, inclusivity pretty much throughout the entire process.
You mentioned a couple of things, JAWS and NDDS or NDDA. What
NVDA. Those are 2 very popular screen reader technologies.
Okay.
JAWS is the equivalent in some ways. You could consider it. It does pair best with Internet Explorer. It's older. It's been around longer, built by a company called Freedom Scientific, now owned by VFO. And NVDA pairs best usually with Firefox as far as compatibility. And it also tends to have that kind of personality as well. It's very crowdsourced research heavy, standards driven, and free.
Is there such a thing as a console window text-based web browser?
You mean as in like gaming consoles?
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking of a standard console app in Windows, or you drop to a command prompt.
Windows has narrator, and so there's that, but it's not as well adopted as some other screen reading technologies. And in general, I think it's because people adopt screen readers if they're younger and they have either an event or they're born with blindness and need screen readers. It happens at an earlier age. So we're talking about sort of a bit of a brand commitment that people make.
And when you say screen reader, you're saying they use the browser, and then this thing reads it to them, right? Not instead of a complete text-based solution. Yeah.
Well, it's at an operating system level, and that was the next thing I was going to mention. So whatever somebody uses needs to be able to handle, being able to work with email programs, applications on the desktop, that kind of thing. Right. So it's beyond just browsing or beyond just web.
But it strikes me that tools like Refactor and CodeRush and stuff, you learn one and you get reflexive at it, and you're going to stay incredibly loyal to that. It is your set of reflexes now.
That's typically the case. Oftentimes we found people who use assistive technologies use either a combination of them, or they may switch back and forth between 2 different ones depending on the effectiveness of it to do a particular thing. So, and there are a lot of people who use screen magnification software along with a screen reader, for example, because they may be low vision, but it's just much easier if they have, increasing text size. At some point, it's good to layer those solutions on top of each other.
Are there new texts coming down the path? I'm thinking specifically there was HTML5 standards around tagging stuff that make life a little easier for this kind of tech?
Well, the good news is what people generally with disabilities need has been around since the web.
Right.
The bad news is that we love to break those rules. So I think that really more than anything, when we do testing for a team and we're trying to identify what gaps exist on their site or their application or their native application, more often than not, about 60 to 70% of the time, what we're pointing out are things that are basically best practices. So again, the good news is that if you're a real student of your craft and you look to aim for web standards and coding best practices, and you think in terms of semantic structure and progressive enhancement, you're actually going to be doing a lot to make your applications and your sites more accessible. There's always going to be a gap in between newest technologies and assistive technologies trying to catch up to those newer technologies, but that gap is pretty small now.
Hey guys, hold that thought right there while we take a moment to hear from our sponsor. This episode of .NET Rocks is made possible in part by Windows on the Google Cloud Platform.
You may not know this, but the Google Cloud Platform supports Windows Server 2008, 2012, and 2016.
It also supports SQL Server versions 2012, 2014, and 2016 standard, web, and enterprise editions with high availability.
You can deploy your ASP.NET Windows apps to Compute Engine or your ASP.NET Core apps to App Engine or Container Engine. That's Google's hosted Kubernetes environment.
.NET and .NET Core libraries are there for all 200 plus Google.com and cloud services in NuGet, led by John Skeet of Stack Overflow fame.
But what about Visual Studio integration? Oh, it's there. You can use Visual Studio to manage your GCP resources and deploy your existing apps.
You get stack driver logging, error reporting, and tracing support for .NET and .NET Core.
PowerShell commandlets for GCP, which run on Windows and Linux.
And a great set of partners to bring your Windows and .NET workloads to GCP, including Capgemini, Nudesic, and Magenic.
So go to gcp.netrocks.com and get your free trial today.
And you're listening to .NET Rocks. Richard and I are here with Elle Waters talking about accessibility for UX. And I love where this conversation is going. I mean, it started with, how can we help blind people and deaf people? And now we're talking about, if you code for accessibility first, you're going to help everybody, not just your challenged people, but everybody who uses your app. Do you see that happening? That's in your bio that you see amazing things happen.
Yeah, it's a pretty aspirational bio, but it is based off of real experiences. We find that companies who adopt this not just as a checklist, but really as a way of being able to increase the value of what they're producing for their customers, that it opens doors that otherwise wouldn't have been opened. So one thing we've discovered through usability testing is that people with disabilities will find something like a problem with a website quicker, and the problem is more pronounced for them. But they find a lot of the same problems. And so Susanna Gonzalez in Smashing Magazine once wrote about designing for the extremes, and it's very similar. And you think about that, about people who are aging into any kind of impairments. People might have temporary disabilities. And the idea is if you design for the extremes, you meet the needs of the many. And so it just creates a much more expansive, inclusive, and usable application.
Fantastic.
Yeah, very cool concept. We're not just talking about the web now, though, right? Like, obviously, mobile, sort of traditional desktop apps. Is the tooling even remotely similar? I mean, responsive web design seems very distinct to the web.
Yeah, so responsive, obviously, very distinct. So what ends up happening is when we're working with teams on native applications or kiosks or wearable technology, all of which are encompassed in the work that we do, we typically, a lot of the user experience best practices are principles about users. And so that carries over from one kind of interaction to the other. And how you meet those needs, the technique itself might vary according to the technology. But a lot of these principles really are able, if you start thinking about inclusive design and how to build something inclusively, you're able to apply those same questions to the other kinds of interactions and interfaces that you build for.
So it sounds to me like I just need to include some folks with maybe vision or hearing impairments as part of my user experience testing, and generally everything will get better.
Yes, you'll definitely identify the need. And then as far as the technique, there's a lot of great publications out there. And honestly, I would say that probably a list apart is one of the best places if you want to visit somewhere and see really great articles about accessibility that really align to web standards. Another place, of course, is on Twitter. If you use the hashtag A11Y, which is basically because there's 11 letters between A and Y in accessibility, much like internationalization. If you follow that hashtag, you'll find some great tips as well.
And the A11Y project is an interesting collection of stuff.
Yeah, that's a bit of crowdsourcing. And so it's really interesting. Another really great thing to look at is Shopify is doing some amazing stuff with regards to the idea of design systems and accessibility. There's some areas that they're still working on, but the principles behind the way that they're building their pattern library and design system, having it with accessibility integrated within it is exactly the way to make this sort of scalable and sustainable.
So like OWASP for security, these are checklists for things you should be doing before you even start your testing.
Yeah. The sooner that you start considering it and including it, the better your success will be and the less expensive the project will be. Definitely.
Now, you just said the magic word, the less expensive, right? I mean,
Right,
this is what the manager hears when we say we want to add, put in the budget for accessibility. How does that translate into actual dollars saved or more users gained?
Right. And one of the first questions is how soon into the project have you started working with those kinds of considerations, and how repeatable is what you're building going to be? So the first project is always going to be a certain amount of investment when you're trying to standardize something. But this is why accessibility can save money, because it provides sort of skin in the game for people to really adhere to a pattern library.
Yeah.
And that makes operational stuff so much smoother.
Yeah, retrofitting it is the hard part. I've certainly done that with like going multilingual. Retrofitting existing apps to multilingual is just super hard to see an ROI on that.
Yeah, we've had this experience on the show when there's somebody giving developers advice. Maybe it's about a methodology, or maybe it's about something to further their career, or some new tool that they want to use, or whatever. If you can turn it into, and if we do this, this is how much money we'll save. If you can make an argument for either you're saving money or you're increasing your user base. In this case, it's probably both, I imagine. I mean, that's something you can take to the bank.
Absolutely. And in the Lean Accessibility Workshop that I do, it's really pretty much because I love combining the two things that I'm most in love with in the development community, and that is agile ways of thinking and doing things and accessibility. And so in that, there's a whole section where we start really unpacking what value means, because obviously agile is really about providing more value for the end customer, whether that be your business stakeholder or their customers. And there's different ways to define value, from commercial value, operational value, customer value, and really looking at each one of those and finding where accessibility can be an advantage to that is really that area, what I was talking about as far as being a catalyst for these things, because it can drive a lot of innovation within an organization. It's a lot like the way when you see companies go through an agile transformation, and they're more than just kind of going through the ceremonies and going through the motions, but they're really starting to think about the way to provide the most value. A lot of bloat, for lack of a better word, really kind of falls away, and teams operate much more productively.
Interesting. Yeah. Is that just because it gets more complex that you try and skim that bloat away, or because the accessibility pieces really focus in? I'm just trying to figure out why this works this way.
Well, accessibility is often brought to a company because they have maybe some external pressure to do something, or it may be a combination of that plus their desire to be more expansive and understand how to appeal to more of a customer base. But in order for accessibility to be successful, there are certain requirements to be able to put into place. And one has to do with the idea of standardizing. And that standardization is something that kind of drives a lot of that streamlining of effort. So when you look at that, plus the fact that ultimately accessibility is about people, and people are really what Agile tends to focus on. So
Right.
we're able to go through a prioritization and business value kind of exercise. And that means that there's a lot of tendencies and practices that are a bit old-fashioned in the way that accessibility used to be sort of forced onto teams. That's not really applicable anymore. And so really looking at even minimum viable product with regards to accessibility and prioritizing what is the greatest user impact and preferencing those first. And then knowing that Agile promotes iteration, meaning that you can go back and continue to improve on what you're providing for people. I think that's just the momentum that they each give each other.
Awesome.
Hey, Richard,
Yeah, buddy.
guess what time it is now?
It must be that happy time again.
Yeah. It's time for us to figure out how to include more .NET Rocks listeners and keep out those meddling zombies at the same time. How can we work on exclusion, not inclusion? It's actually time to give away a D-Experience subscription from DevExpress to one lucky member of the .NET Rocks fan club. Become a UI superhero with DevExpress UI controls and libraries, and deliver elegant .NET solutions that address customer needs today and leverage your existing knowledge to build next-generation touch-enabled solutions for tomorrow. Whether it's an Office-inspired application or a data-centric analytics dashboard, DevExpress Universal ships with everything you'll need to build your best without limits or compromise. And check out their new DevExtreme React Grid, built from the ground up to fully support all the cool features that come with React, like the virtual DOM, state controllers like Redux, etc. And it supports master detail, sorting, grouping, paging, and editing. You can check it out and test it for free by getting it from GitHub. Learn more and download your free 30-day trial of DevExpress Universal at devexpress.com/superhero.
All right, buddy. Who's our winner?
Today's winner, Richard, is George Bellety.
Congratulations, George.
Yeah.
Golf clap for you, sir.
And George just won the D-Experience subscription, a big pile of awesome from our friends at DevExpress, just for being a member of the .NET Rocks fan club. And you know, if you don't know what that is, go to .NETRocks.com, click on the big Get Free Stuff button, answer a few questions, and join the .NET Rocks fan club. We have thousands of members all over the world, and every show we like to give away stuff from our sponsors. And every December, we give away a $5,000 technology shopping spree to one lucky member of the .NET Rocks fan club. But you got to sign up to win. We also like to ask our guests, Elle, if you had $5,000 to spend today on technology, what would you buy?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked.
Didn't see that one coming.
Yeah, so I think about this a lot, actually. So I'm a huge fan of virtual reality, and I'm also a pretty big geek. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And I love the technologies that are coming out with VR to the point. I'm also a big gamer, and my biggest problem is that exercise is boring, but gaming is awesome.
Yeah.
And so I look at the Virtuix Omni positioning, where you have those big wheels, those donuts that you strap to yourself with a belt, and you're able to run in place and turn.
The Omni Tread.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So like say you're turning around. Well, that wouldn't fill up $5,000 because now, thanks to technology and innovation, it's getting cheaper and cheaper. So I was thinking about this and thinking what the next evolution of that, whatever it is they haven't released to anybody, that's really what I want. And I don't know if that means Star Trek's holographic, kind of floor where I can basically have a whole room. But to me, an immersive virtual reality experience that was top of the line would be amazing. That's what I would choose.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
I would like to, you could get one of those Virtuix Omnis and paint your room at the same time, probably spend $5,000.
Yeah, I think the basic package now is like $1,200. You still need the computer and the VR headset and some other bits pieces. You'll get through $5,000 there.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm putting it on my wish list for Christmas and just kind of putting a big hint all over the house for my husband. So we'll see how that works.
We need a room dedicated to this stuff.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that OmniTread does require specific shoes, right? Like it's
I saw that. It's shoes that have really cool like touch sensors underneath it, but it also allows you to be able to run without like completely busting your chin open running into things.
It's slippy. They've got just enough traction, but they slide on the surface that you're on. So it's an interesting combination of stuff.
I kind of want to play Team Fortress 2 with it more than anything else, just because it's such a very run, turn, shoot kind of game.
Yeah.
And I would love to be able to do that with that. So
I don't know. I giggle too much when I play Team Fortress 2. It's so silly that it's very funny. It is good time to be giant, man.
Yes. Exactly. Well, when the Pyro video came out, I was super excited, and I actually got the print of him with all the or her with all the rainbow, like the view from Pyro's point of view. That's my favorite. So, and I really do think that the accessibility team at any organization can easily fit within Team Fortress 2 roles. So that can be another conversation we have.
It's interesting to think about first-person shooters with accessibility in mind.
Yeah. People do it a lot, though. It's a fantastic thing to explore.
Yeah, no kidding. Like you're just going to think about it differently. Who knows? Someone not sighted that's actually playing the game a different way. They might be completely lethal.
Yeah, they usually are. It's true.
You don't even know what hits you. You know what's beyond the sort of OmniTread would be a flying harness. Would be something with hydraulics that you literally could take off the ground, or at least feel like you're lifting off. It may not go very far, but you don't need to. You just need to have that kinetic effect.
You're thinking of Kerbal, aren't you, Richard?
No. The trick with Kerbal is just to send you directly to vomiting, right?
You know what? You need a interface for Kerbal to the Tesla Model S. I drove my first Tesla this weekend. And it's amazing. I didn't get to open it up, but I was in the back seat when the driver hit the gas to the floor, and it felt like one of those rides at Disney where you feel like you're having an out-of-body experience. And then I remembered, I am having an out-of-body experience. There's my body right in the back seat, and I'm on the hood.
Kind of brings full closure to Mission to Mars, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. That's exactly what I thought it was. That was the only other time I've had experienced that many Gs.
Maybe that's what gave Elon Musk the idea.
Maybe.
This 4K 43-inch screen has already given me vertigo playing Kerbal. Like, I've turned around doing an orbital repair in a spacesuit and suddenly seen the planet below me and gone, "Whoa!" and turn back. Don't look out. Out is bad.
Wow.
Fantastic.
Do you have any more stories that you can tell about ways in which accessibility saved your bacon?
Ways that accessibility saved our bacon.
Yeah, or just innovative ways that you've had to implement it. We're just looking for stories.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something that's like, got the same kind of appeal as some of this stuff is so nerdy that if I were to tell you like, hey, there was a team who really didn't think that they could create a responsive table and maintain it as a table. That doesn't sound very exciting.
No, that's exciting to our listeners. Yeah,
that's true. Well, good. I'm so glad. So
Absolutely.
We had a team that we were working with, and they had to launch. They were working on a pretty high-profile e-commerce site, and they were having to launch a responsive version of a table. And tables actually are for tabular data. And so if you decide that you're going to be, we have a phrase, just because you call it a table, if it's a div, if it acts like a table and you think of it like a table, you use it like a table, make it a table.
Yeah.
And so they kind of ushered a challenge to our team and said that they really didn't think that could be made into a mobile version and still have the UI that was needed. So our team loves a good challenge. We love hearing that things are impossible to be made accessible. And so within the span of a couple of days, we put together something for them. And lo and behold, yes, you can create a responsive table, and you can maintain all the semantic structure on a desktop that you did before. We're also working on some stuff with Philips Hue light bulbs that's kind of cool, and using that within sort of a teaching mechanism on teaching devs when they commit something that has no accessibility issues versus something that they need to look at, and using the colors to be able, colors and haptic response in order to be able to give them a kind of feedback, which is kind of fun. That's exciting too. Mm-hmm. So there's lots of ways that people work on this. And I think that contrary to what people sometimes think, traditionally, accessibility doesn't really provide constraints as much as it is a creative focus. So we've found often that it makes really good designers great designers, and really good developers great developers, because it provides that challenge for them to rethink their assumptions.
Yeah, it sure does. And we got to get out of this mindset of saying, we're only going to be serving, 1 or 2% of our customers if we do this. And
I tell you, every time I see somebody who tells me their Internet Explorer requirements, I kind of laugh to myself, because I think, okay, so what's that percentage again that we're building for? Okay, just want to keep that in mind.
Right.
So,
right. And as we've seen, when you put accessibility first, you make everybody's experience better.
Yeah, by far.
Yeah.
Hey, Elle, how much does the built-in accessibility features of Windows 10 simplify our lives as developers when we're building for that machine?
Somewhat, not much.
Okay.
I think more than anything more than anything, the most you get out of anything natively built in is with native applications.
Right.
So Android and iOS have a ton of accessibility built into their native controls. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where you're going to get that kind of simplification and ease of use in creating something that's easily accessible. I think it's a different challenge altogether when you're talking about at an operating system level. Although, like I said, I know Microsoft has a tremendous commitment. They're constantly looking at ways that people use their devices, their machines, their operating system, their applications. And so when you're coming up with an application, it's really best to look at some of the documentation at the beginning, but then you're really thinking about, again, going back to user testing. And so I would say somewhat, but not a tremendous amount yet.
Even for all these years, they've been building all those tools and they're always there. It seems interesting to me that it's just not that simple.
Yeah, and it's a process thing. Accessibility is a process and a people consideration and challenge. Whereas if it was all about technology, we could have flipped that switch a long time ago, right?
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about the moderated testing that you guys do at
Sure.
Simply Accessible?
So we've been doing usability testing for a dozen years or so, and we found that it's difficult to be able to think about it from the sort of old traditional method of usability testing, where you have a usability test lab and you recruit people and they come into that test lab, because people with disabilities have very specific needs and they have very customized kinds of setups, and those are usually at home. So then the next iteration of that traditionally was to go to people's homes. But then you have a geographic constraint there, and it takes a lot more time, and it's a bit invasive to go into somebody's house. And so our goal was to do remote testing, and we looked at some unmoderated testing options. And when we did that, we still didn't get quite the insights that we wanted. So our team really worked hard. And over the last several years, we've started doing just about with every project, we do remote moderated usability testing. We'll take about 5 to 8 participants, and we have a panel of about, say, I think 300 to 400 people. And we also work with customers from our clients or disability advocacy groups. And so we do a lot of the same traditional usability testing, but because it's remote and moderated, 2 really great things. We have video from those insights and those sessions to be able to provide for clients, and it's able to keep pace with an agile team. Whereas before, usability test results would come back, it might be 6 weeks after somebody's launched something. And so for us, we're able to throw that in immediately and get that really quick feedback that we like to be able to put into somebody's backlog to be able to look at for improvements in the future. And we're really excited about the fact that now we're doing this with native applications as well.
Very cool. And by moderated, I guess you mean you have some oversight. You're not allowing the testers to do their own reports or something. You have an intermediary between the testers and your documentation?
Right. So we'll have a test script and we'll have specific goals that we've worked on with our clients of what we'd like to get more insight into. But oftentimes when people have disabilities, they may come to a hard stop on something.
Yeah.
And instead of that ending the session right there, we use a lot of remote desktop sharing. We'll go in and be able to click a button, note that in the test that they weren't able to complete the task, and continue with the session.
Excellent.
The other thing is if they have a problem, we're able to explore that and get their feedback instead of just user abandon the test, for example. We're able to find out exactly what's most problematic and get really detailed feedback.
Fantastic.
One of our most exciting, I guess you could say exciting moments is one of our clients is a pretty big social media provider, and we were working with a participant who was both deaf and blind, and we were able to use the chat function in order to be able to get insight from that participant, and that was wonderful. That was really exciting that we've gotten to that point in technology.
That's pretty cool.
So if they're deaf and blind, how are they getting information out of the computer?
So usually people will use a combination of a screen reader and something that's called a refreshable braille device that's connected to it. And it looks a bit like a Casio keyboard. It's kind of cool. And then it's got these pins that dynamically raise and lower. And it goes, say, 40 to 80 characters across.
Wow.
And it's a very linear way to consume information, which is why we often recommend people to front load content instead of learn more about and this long string. And then finally, the different, quality piece of information is at the end of that string of text. We really encourage people to think in terms of what if somebody only had, a split second, what is the most valuable piece of information? And part of that is in consideration for people who might be consuming it through something like a refreshable braille device.
That is amazing.
It's pretty cool, huh? Yeah, I know. And those are all portable. I mean, what's amazing is that people aren't stuck at home with a giant, refrigerator-sized piece of technology. They're at a point now where you can hook a refreshable braille device up to a mobile device.
Mm. Wow.
But I get that this is very personal gear. You're going to want to use your braille device with your equipment. Everybody's
with your settings, your speed.
Yeah. Very personal.
And I imagine that your team includes everyone of every conceivable type of disability, so that they can that you don't leave any stone unturned.
Yeah, it's really important for us. We allow that's again the beauty of Agile is that we'll try and cover everything, and then we work with our clients to prioritize based on what they understand about their users. So we'll go as deep as we can on understanding what challenges people have. The good thing is you don't have to design and develop for specific individual use cases. If you start with those best practices, then you can tweak things and minor corrections according to different user groups. So you don't have to put best used with JAWS 18, for example, on your website.
If you think about sites that fail the Simply Accessible test of accessibility, are there any very popular sites that could really use some usability testing?
That could use some usability testing?
Yeah.
Sure. Do you want me to out the specific
Let's
people?
do it.
With all, all right. This is the moment of the show where we go into the walk of shame for customers. Now,
here comes
these
the bus.
are not our clients, obviously. But I say this. Let me preface this with I am an avid user of this site and I use it quite a bit.
Okay.
But Amazon.com has some pretty terrible focus management and tab order.
Whoa.
I'm painfully empathetic to what it must be like to build a behemoth site with that many different kinds of interactions and workflows and not really have time to slow down and really think from a strategic point of view about overall architecture and things like tab order. But the tab order on Amazon.com is abysmal. It's pretty bad. There will be things that will jump to one side of the page, then another, skip over other content entirely. And that's tough for non-sighted keyboard users who use a screen reader. It's also pretty bad for sighted keyboard users because it's taking them to places on the page they may not even understand where the focus is at that moment. So that's probably my number one egregious.
Well, Facebook's got to be pretty awesome, right?
Actually, I will say Facebook has worked very hard over the years. They have an equal challenge of the fact that they have a site that really can't go down for maintenance, for example. So they really, and everything ultimately comes down to strategy and architecture when you want to do it properly. But they have a pretty robust accessibility team. They're very responsive. And I know quite a few people who are keyboard only users who do pretty well at most of the core Facebook features. We're going to start venturing into people who are our clients, though, if we keep going down this route. Yeah. So I want to be careful because it would be easy for me to brag about our clients. I would love to, but at the same time, that sounds a little bit self-serving. So I have to be careful.
Yeah, I was more concerned about any of the big ones, like Amazon is a pretty big one, you know.
And that one makes total sense to me, too, because it's just so much stuff.
Yeah.
That web
it's
page.
So much stuff. And there's templates, I'm sure, from an authoring environment that they have their own, for vendors who want to be able to put their wares out there. There's a lot of things that they can customize, like in a content management system. And that in and of itself is a challenge to be able to how much do you lock that down? How much do you require? What part of the workflow do you stop if somebody hasn't put, for example, a text equivalent on an image? And so it gets pretty challenging, and it's the kind of thing that this would be sort of an Olympic challenge to be able to take the existing Amazon.com site and make it fully accessible. Right. Whereas, at this point, everyone's innovating. It's time, and they may already be working on this in the background to really rethink everything.
Well, so much of Amazon.com is generated dynamically. It's specific to you.
Right.
Yeah.
It's almost untestable.
Well, there's ways to do it. You just have to be really thoughtful and really specific about standards and categories. Mm-hmm. And I think that they really struggled when they moved their site to a more responsive layout. They made those choices like, we're going to remove some content in the mobile viewport. And then people would get frustrated because they're expecting to get access to it. So then they would go to the full site instead in their mobile viewport, which is painful in and of itself, right? But then when they would try and select something, it would do a media query and throw them right back into the mobile viewport, which didn't have content that they were looking for. So that's just a usability failure. And they had some real challenges with that. So yeah, I would say Amazon's at the top of my list as far as sites that are very challenging. I think job application sites tend to be very difficult too, which is unfortunate given that starts becoming almost like a discrimination point. That's really tough. Yeah. And I think a lot of the tech giants are doing pretty well, actually. Between Google and Apple and Microsoft, I think a lot of these guys are really seeing the need to come at it from an enterprise sort of architectural point of view. Microsoft has a chief accessibility officer, which is awesome. And he's very invested in things. And then, I think that we're definitely on the upswing, on the rise, thanks to mobile adoption, which kind of requires people to think in terms of standards and flexibility.
Yeah. Now, what about Gmail? How do they rate?
Gmail's pretty good. Google Docs still has some ways to go, but as far as all of the sort of G Suite applications, Gmail is pretty good. There's a lot of shortcut keys within Gmail that may be at times in conflict with what somebody's already set up as shortcut keys on his or her screen reader, for example. But from a keyboard accessibility, they have a pretty dedicated accessibility team as well. And they've made huge strides with Google Docs in particular. And I hope that Google Slides is next on the list because there's some things that are really tough to reach with a keyboard with that. But generally speaking, we see improvements from time to time with a lot of these large applications. It's not that these teams aren't making efforts. It's that it's difficult, I think, once you've built something to retroactively go back and try and remediate at that large of a scale, which is why we say build in from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah, that's been a recurring theme here. It's like, if you've got any thoughts to accessibility at all, get started at the beginning on it. Yeah.
You will be so grateful afterwards. And I mean, it really is not, it's not very much about the kind of technology stack you choose. Our team has written 2 really robust articles and tutorials on Angular. We work with teams who work with React. We help people build their own sort of JavaScript libraries around more complex interactions. And none of that is really a detractor from being able to make things more accessible. A lot of it has to do with being thoughtful about it in the beginning, because there's a lot of interaction patterns that get established that engineers have to kind of inherit after the fact.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Well, Elle, this has been a great hour. And wow, I learned a lot. And I'm sure our listeners did too. Thanks for spending it with us.
Thank you so much for having me. And I was so excited to see you guys at NDC Oslo. Are you going to be at NDC Sydney too?
I will be, but I will have been by the time the show is published. But Carl's not, so I'll be around.
All right. Maybe next year.
Excellent. Well, we should share a pint together in Australia.
That's my plan.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks, Elle.
Thank you, guys.
All right. We'll see you next time on .NET Rocks. .NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Pwop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time.
Got transmitter bands by the